Hi everyone, this is Dr. Pollock. In this video, I'm going to talk about voting behavior in American elections, as you can see here on the screen. We'll get to that discussion in a bit. To start out with, here's just a few items from the news that I wanted to talk about briefly. So you guys, in the course of writing your paper 2, you're thinking about elections and how they're being affected potentially by the virus situation. And so there are a few things I, just in my sweep of the news today that I found relating to that. So some states are, as we've talked about before, having to reconfigure their primaries. So here's Ohio. They are moving, or they have moved, I should say, their primary to vote by mail only, with a few exceptions. So this is just an article I was reading. It seems like it's from a local Ohio news outlet to where it's going vote by mail. Normally people would have the option to to vote based on any means they wanted to. If they wanted to show up in person, they'd be able to. Here, vote by mail up till April the 28th. With one exception here, interesting to note, if you're somebody who requires special equipment to vote based on impairments in your ability to see or hear, you're still able to show up in person. So, interesting changes being made in Ohio. And this is, just Ohio isn't anything special. I don't think in this respect, this is the type of change that many states are going through. And probably the type of thing that many of you are writing about in your paper number 2. On a similar note, one thing that's interesting that's starting to emerge in this, we talked about the Wisconsin situation, or I did in my last video, and here's sort of a similar situation involving Nevada. It's interesting to watch as these changes are being made to the primaries. As they unfold, oftentimes you're seeing differences or disagreement, maybe is a better way to put it, in terms of exactly what changes should be made. It's predictable, right? Whenever we're going into pretty dramatic and pretty sudden changes to the way our elections are working, different people, and in this case, different parties may have differences in terms of how they want these changes to be made and exactly what should happen, right? So here, we're talking in Nevada. And this is actually different than we talked about the Nevada caucus earlier as it pertains to the presidential election. Here, they have separate primaries, which are scheduled for June, from what I recall from this article. Dealing with congressional elections and other statewide offices, not the presidential election that's already been decided in Nevada, the primary, but primaries for other offices. And here, it's talking about how Nevada has elected to move to vote by mail for their primary as well. There are differences in terms of how the two parties want this vote by mail to proceed, though, right? So here, this is talking about a lawsuit that the Democratic Party is filing against the state of Nevada, with the intention here of having the state change certain procedures in the vote by mail. The Republicans, they're according to this article, seemingly going to jump in to this lawsuit on the side of the state of Nevada. And what's at stake here is just you read through here, and it's talking about the Democrats want to expand in-person voting. I'm not exactly sure what this is aimed at, whether it may have something to do with people who need special accommodations, like we were talking about in Ohio in the last article. The Democrats in Nevada and other states are trying to get this put into place, the idea that everyone who is registered, whether they request a ballot or not, will be sent a mail-in ballot, which normally you would only be sent a mail-in ballot if you requested one. Here the Democrats are saying we should send everyone, based on the circumstances, a mail-in ballot, whether or not they decide to actually request one. Here's something that's actually pretty controversial in general, not just in the context of the COVID-19 outbreak. Here it's talking about the Democrats. They want to relax rules barring anyone but family members from turning in ballots on behalf of others. All right, so this may be if you're somebody who follows elections closely, or if you're somebody who has followed particular elections closely, that this may be a concept that's ringing bells to you. The way that elections or vote by mail would normally work is that you get the ballot and you are responsible for returning it, or somebody in your immediate family is also allowed to return the ballot on your behalf. What's in question here in Nevada, and actually throughout the country, this is being hashed out whether or not it should be allowed. What's in question here is whether or not others those who are not in your immediate family, perhaps those who are working for political organizations or political campaigns, should be able to go around and collect these mail-in ballots on a sort of mass scale and return them in bulk, right? So here, the practice that we're talking about, if you've ever heard the term ballot harvesting, which is, I don't think I've discussed it yet in this class, but it's an emerging discussion in election administration, just whether this should be allowed, right? Should we, on one hand, those who are opposed to this practice are saying this is potentially threatening the security of the votes if anyone's allowed to go around and collect these mail-in ballots in bulk and return them on their own. So the question here is, if you allow campaign workers, for instance, or those affiliated with the political organization, if you allow them to go around collecting ballots, is it always going to be on the up and up? That's at least the question that detractors of this practice would point out. On the other hand, those who are in favor of it, for instance, the Democratic Party in Nevada here, they say that those who are maybe underserved, those who don't have access to post offices or mailboxes, live in remote locations, those who live on Native American reservations, for instance, I don't believe I've read before, not in this specific case, but broadly speaking, they don't have daily mail delivery or collection, so perhaps it's more difficult for them. This article talks about seniors living in assisted living facilities who maybe could use the assistance of just having someone come up and, someone else come and pick their ballot up and not have to worry about the mailing. So this is a question, ballot harvesting. Should we allow third parties to come around and collect mail-in ballots from people? If you recall here, so the overall situation of ballot harvesting in the country is that in some states it's legal and in some states it's not legal. This is one of those things in election administration to where it's left up to the states to decide. And we talked about this, right? The main thing that the federal government regulates in terms of elections is money, right? So the federal government sets limits on how much money can be contributed and limits as far as how much money PACs can get to candidates and this sort of thing we've talked about. What the federal government doesn't regulate and what's left up to the states is exactly how the voting occurs. Mail-in balloting, who can or cannot turn in the mail-in ballots. Those are things determined by the states. And so we have this situation where ballot harvesting is legal in some places and illegal in other places. One place where it's legal, probably the most notable example, gets talked about in California a lot. It's legal in California to go around collecting ballots and other people's ballots and turn them in. And it's subject to the same controversy I just mentioned in terms of those opposed and those against it. One place where it's illegal, if you guys, local example, if you recall back last year, we had in North Carolina, the 9th congressional district. I don't know if anyone is from there, but we had in the 9th district in North Carolina, a redone election, right? The original election happened on the election night. This would have been going back to November 2018. It's determined that there were irregularities in that election, and it was eventually thrown out. And then we had a special election for the House seat in the North Carolina 9th congressional district. And that was on account of ballot harvesting. Okay, so if ballot harvesting is illegal in North Carolina, it was determined that in that race, I think it was specifically the Republican candidate or those who were affiliated with the Republican candidate going around collecting ballots from others and from different people and turning them in bulk. That's a practice which in the state of North Carolina is not allowed. You're supposed to, or someone who is in your immediate family, turn in the ballot for you or mail in the ballot for you. Ballot harvesting was happening in that race. And so there was a redone race, a special election there in the 9th district. And so it's just interesting. So this article, I guess, is just interesting in terms of just the overall effect of COVID-19. And this is just this issue of ballot harvesting is something that I think is worth talking about, at least briefly, in the context of the course, since we haven't discussed it yet. So a couple of different reasons I wanted to discuss this article. And this is all presumably something that'll be determined in the course of this lawsuit, whether or not the state of Nevada will be obliged to allow ballot harvesting during this primary election. Then finally, this final story is not something that's strictly speaking or really at all tied to the COVID-19 outbreak. It's just something that I happened to come across as I was going through the news this week. There's this court case pending, or actually two court cases, which are related to one another and being ruled on jointly by the Supreme Court regarding this concept of faithless electors, which again, I think this is a topic. I don't know if it's strictly speaking that important, at least the way things have shaped up in electoral history to this point in our country. But there is this idea of faithless electors, which you've probably heard of before. And if you recall back to our discussion of the Electoral College, we're talking about electors in the Electoral College. They're supposed to vote for the person who wins the popular vote, the candidate which wins the popular vote in their state, with the exception of Nebraska and Maine. The states all have these winner-take-all allocation mechanisms for their ballot or their electoral votes. So if you're an elector in the state of North Carolina and Donald Trump wins the state of North Carolina, you're supposed to vote for Donald Trump in the Electoral College. When you go on and actually, it's December when the Electoral College actually convenes in each state, you're supposed to vote for Trump. A faithless elector is a term to describe an elector in the Electoral College who either attempts to or does vote contrary to what the vote was in that person's state. For example, this is one of those things that the 2016 election actually provides good examples of. Here, if you look at the Electoral College breakdown, this is a graph that I grabbed from Wikipedia, which is actually useful here. So you see these various bubbles here, and Washington is of interest here. So there are a couple of voters. So Clinton wins the state of Washington. However, there are electors in Washington who decide, I'm not going to vote for Clinton in the Electoral College. I'm going to vote for Colin Powell, or I'm going to vote for Spotted Eagle, who is I forget exactly the details, a Native American political activist. I don't remember the tribe or exactly what her activism is all about, but that's who she is, or he or she, I should say. In Texas, on the other hand, you have Donald Trump winning the state at large. So presumably he should have gotten all the electoral votes here. However you look, you see one elector votes for Ron Paul, one elector votes for John Kasich. Okay, so Washington is actually one of the states that's involved in this lawsuit. One of the lawsuits I was talking about in that article. Washington is at stake here. Colorado is an interesting case in that Clinton wins, and when the Electoral College met in Colorado, there was an elector who actually attempted to cast a vote for somebody else. However, the law in Colorado says that you are obliged as an elector to actually vote for the person who wins the state, and Colorado reserves the right to replace you if you attempt to vote for somebody else. So again, here we have a taste of federalism and exactly what happens in these states. Colorado outright bans you or replaces you if you try to vote for somebody who you're not supposed to as an elector. In Washington, so these are the two states that are involved in these two lawsuits I talked about. On one hand, Colorado, the person who was thrown out is suing Colorado, saying that that was illegitimate, that this person should have been allowed to actually vote faithlessly. In Washington, things operate a little bit differently here. As you can see, there were 4 faithless electoral votes in Washington, and these people were fined. Okay, so there's a fine. I think it was $1,000 if you are an elector in the Electoral College in Washington and you cast your vote for somebody else. $1,000. Not a ton of money, I guess, in the grand scheme of things when you consider the event in which this race came down to one or a few electoral votes here. Potentially, the overall threat or concern is just, do we ever get into a circumstance in which faithless electors in a really close election could potentially try to throw things, tip the scale one direction or another? And so it's somewhat of a gray zone, constitutionally speaking, or in general, our electoral system, it's a gray zone, right? The presence of faithless electors, things like Colorado, is the state allowed to ban a faithless elector, or is this something that they should be allowed to do? And that's the topic of these 2 Supreme Court cases that I mentioned are being heard jointly. These are, so it's Colorado Department of State versus Baca, and then Chiafalo v. Washington. So as I mentioned, these are involving people in those 2 states casting faithless electoral votes. And what the court's going to decide here is just, do the states have the right to restrict faithless electoral votes? If they say, yes, the states do have this right, then it kind of puts a seal on this overall concern that perhaps one day faithless electors might tip things one direction or another. On the other hand, if they say no, states can't do this, it leaves things really ambiguous, right? It's to where not necessarily it's not necessarily that we're anticipating a faithless elector ever having necessarily having the ability to change the outcome of an election, but it would be a possibility still. So this is one thing that the Supreme Court is going to rule on in the coming months. I would say probably not weeks, but months. One way that this does connect, this isn't really the Supreme Court and what's going on in their operation isn't really the purview of this class, but it is interesting. One thing that is connecting this story to our overall COVID-19 situation is that for the first time ever, the Supreme Court is going to be hearing its oral arguments in this case, these two cases and other cases that have been delayed by teleconference. Okay, so here they're going to be, I don't know if it's going to be Zoom or what, but they're going to be hearing these, at the Supreme Court, each case gets an hour allocated for oral arguments, and that's going to be done in order to get these cases on the docket going again remotely through teleconference. It's going to be something that's publicly available. You'll be able to watch the oral arguments, which is again the first time that's ever been the case in the Supreme Court. And presumably this will happen. The ruling on this case will not happen in the context of this semester, but later on down the line, probably before the election. This will be ruled on, and something we can look for there. Okay, so that's what I wanted to mention just in terms of what's going on, in current events and elections. You guys, you're working on your paper and thinking about the topic of the paper, and so maybe this brought up some thoughts in that regard. Anyway, the topic of today's lecture is voting behavior. Okay, so you recall back a few weeks ago we were talking about social forces and how they influence the vote. Here we're going to talk about a bunch of other potential determinants of the vote. So here, the overall discussion is this is primarily something we'll talk in the context of presidential elections. The discussion is what's causing someone to decide to vote for the Republican presidential candidate or the Democratic presidential candidate. Okay, and in this case, I'm not going to give you a single answer, but I'm going to explore a number of different explanatory factors that political scientists have put forward to answer this question. So we'll talk about issue voting, retrospective voting, party ID. And so these are all things that have empirical backing in political science literature. So we'll have a number of different potential answers to this question of what's causing someone to vote for the Republican or the Democrat. That being said, eventually I think we'll get to the point where I will identify one of these factors as probably more important than the other two. So you can stay tuned for that, but we'll go through each of them. In this case, so this is going through chapters 6, 7, and 8, or at least it's not going through those chapters in a one-for-one basis, but most of what I'm going to discuss has basis in these chapters. The one that you were required to read was the 6, so hopefully you got through that. And then I'm going to just give you the quick summary of what I would say are the most important takeaways from chapters 6 and 7. Okay, so to start out with, let's begin with issue voting. Chapter 6, you guys, having done the reading, will already have some basis for what we're going to say here. Just in terms of terminology, I would point this out. The book from time to time also refers to this as prospective voting, which I will contrast, obviously, this term with retrospective voting here when we get to it. The term sometimes refers to this, the book sometimes refers to issue voting by this term, prospective voting. I'm going to try to avoid that, just to avoid confusion. I'm going to just refer to it as issue voting, but if you heard this term in the book during this chapter 6, prospective voting, this is what they were talking about, just issue voting in general. Where the primary idea here, the reason it's referred to as prospective voting sometimes, is that the idea is that you're going to look at the issue positions you have, you're going to look at the issue positions that you think the candidates will adopt if they're elected, you're taking a prospective look on things, what the future would entail issue-wise if these candidates were elected, and you're determining which candidate you like best based on the orientation of your issue positions to the candidate's issue position. Right? So just to simplify that into a couple of different steps, 3 in particular. If you're somebody who's engaging in issue voting, or what political scientists would describe as issue voting, you're doing a few different things. So the first thing you're doing is you're figuring out where you stand on issues. Okay? You're asking yourself the question, or probably not literally, but at some point in time, you're developing stances on the issues that you hold yourself. Okay, where do I stand on the issues? I'm, for this discussion, probably not going to break things down too much into specific issues. We're talking about, you guys know what political issues are. The economy, abortion, foreign policy, response to a viral outbreak, emergencies, things like this. Different policy issues is what we're talking about. I'm probably going to refer to issues collectively here, just because most of the time people are not concerned with one particular issue. That's not always the case, but most of the time people have multiple issues, or a suite of different issues they're concerned with, where they're going to figure out, okay, I have a position on this issue, and here's what it is. Okay. That's step number 1. Step number 2 would involve going through a similar process with respect to the candidates who are on the ballot. Okay, so every 4 years we'll have at least one different candidate on the ballot speaking to the 2-party presidential nominees. So you're asking yourself, where do the candidates stand on the issues? Okay, so these are two, in some sense, step 1 and 2 are just about securing information or knowledge. You've got to figure out the knowledge of where you stand, and you've got to go and, based on information that's available in the political environment, figure out where the candidates stand. And I mean, I'm spending relatively little time talking about these steps, but they're not really trivial. Okay? Step number 1, forming your own issue positions. That's going to involve learning about politics, learning about the issues, probably thinking about them. Step number 2, that's going to probably involve following the news, learning about the candidates. And the point of me talking about this is just that it's possible, and in fact, it happens extremely often, that people fail to satisfy either step 1 or step 2, right? So when we're talking about issue voting, it's not something that everyone's going to engage in. Some people may not think enough about the issues to really get a stance on their own. Some people may just not follow politics enough to get a good idea of where the candidates stand. And sometimes candidates are ambiguous, and it's not immediately clear where they stand on the issues. So again, I'm going through a simplified step here, just to illustrate the process. And then finally, if you figure out where you are on the issues, you figure out where the 2 candidates are. Here you're voting for the candidate whose issue positions most closely align to your own. Okay, so going through steps 1 and 2, presuming that you perceive some difference in the issue stances between the Republican and the Democratic candidate, you're taking that difference and you're determining which of these 2 candidates most closely aligns with my own views, and that's the candidate you're voting for. Okay, so issue voting, it's about the issues, and that's what's driving your choice. The way that you would normally see this expressed graphically, I think this is sometimes useful to go through for a couple of different reasons. So, I mean, again, just a simplified example. On the left side, let's say liberal positions, conservative positions, and then a midpoint here, moderate positions. Okay, again, just imagining this as a univariate conception of issues. You might break this down into multiple different issues, but we'll just take with one here for the time being. Okay, so you'd have the 2 candidates. Let's say candidate 1 is maybe over here, perhaps a strong liberal. Candidate 2 over here. Let's say a more moderate conservative relative to the liberal, who is a stronger liberal. So if you're the voter, okay, if you happen to be, for instance, we'll say V. If this is you, you're closer to candidate 2, so you would choose to vote for candidate 2. Right? So assuming you have all this information of where you are and then where the 2 candidates are, it's a fairly simple process. You're closer to candidate 2 on the issues, and so that's who you're voting for. If you're somebody who is over here, again, this is probably somewhat self-evident. Much of what I'm going to discuss in this lecture actually probably is somewhat common sense. But here, if you're a voter over here, you're closer to candidate 1, you're voting for this particular candidate. That's issue voting. Okay, assuming that you can place yourself on some scale like this, assuming you know where the other 2 candidates, or where the 2 candidates are oriented relative to yourself, you figure out which candidate is closer to yourself, and that's who you vote for. Okay, I want to get to eventually the evidence here. Okay, so in other words, if we're looking at for empirical evidence of issue voting, does it exist and what form does it take? And we'll talk about that here in a second. One thing this is kind of an aside from what's discussed in the book. One concept I wanted to discuss related to this concept of issue voting, and we'll reuse this conception here in a second. The liberal to conservative continuum. Some of you maybe have heard about the median voter theorem before, which is sort of one implication of issue voting, or at least one prediction that if you assume certain things about the way people vote, for instance, issue voting, and the way the candidates behave, the overall prediction here is that if you align all the different voters on a continuum, so let's say here liberal again, conservative again, let's say instead of having one individual voter, we're looking at the collective issue positions of the entire electorate. We're aligning all the people up between liberal and conservative, and we're looking at the voter who is in the median. Okay, so the median just being 50% to the left, 50% to the right of that voter. Let's say the median voter happens to be maybe right here, where I'll put V_M for a median voter. The median voter theorem predicts that this voter will get what he or she wants. Okay, and I'll explain why in a second. So the median voter theory, the winner of majority voting is the option preferred by the median voter. Okay, so just to illustrate here, if this is the person at the median, so again, you've aligned every voter in terms of liberalism and conservatism. This is the person who is at the median. That's implying that to the left of this person, that's 50% of the electorate. To the right of this person, that's the other 50%, right? So this is a person right in the center. Okay, so you can think through the theorem here and work through the examples of why this is the case, right? So if we have, again, let's say our candidate 1 here, and then let's put candidate 2 somewhere over here. Okay, so if we wanted to look at how this is going to shape up the outcome of this election, okay, we could look at the distance between these 2 candidates, which I'll put here in a dashed line. Okay, this is the distance between these 2 candidates. The halfway point, let's say, is somewhere right here. So this is the halfway point, this line that I just put between candidate 1 and candidate 2. Everyone to the left of this candidate, or everyone to the left of the halfway point here, voting for candidate 1. Everyone to the right is closer to candidate 2, and so they're voting for candidate 2. Okay. In this case, the median voter prefers candidate 1. Okay, so you're getting all the 50% to the left and everyone up to this point. All right, so this shaded area here, these are all people voting for candidate 2. This area that's unshaded, which is more than 50%, this is the person, this is candidate 1's range, and this is the vote that candidate 1's getting, which is more than 50%, which means candidate 1 is winning. So the reason that the median voter theorem is interesting, at least for me at this point in our discussion, is just this. Okay, if you look at, just a clean up our discussion here, if you're looking at what the implication for candidate behavior is, okay, so if you're candidate 1 and you're trying to win, and you're candidate 2 and you're trying to win, okay, if you're candidate 1, you're in good shape in this current scenario, okay, because the median voter is closer to you. If you're candidate 2, you know you're going to lose because candidate 1 is closer. So the implication here, if we're talking about rational choice, or if you're familiar with game theory at all, the decision for candidate 2 would be to move closer to the left, toward the median voter, toward some area in which this person, maybe candidate 1, would like to move from here to where they're right next to the median voter. So this person is winning now. Okay, what's the implication there? For candidate 1, if that happens, candidate 1 is incentivized to move toward the median voter as well. Okay, so the overall prediction here, I guess, is the point is that if we assume that issue voting is going on at a wide scale in the electorate, and everyone's voting based on which candidate is closer to their own issue positions, we're expecting convergence toward the median voter. Okay, we're not expecting necessarily polarization. We're expecting that the candidates will more or less move toward one another because both of them are trying to win. And what we see is actually in reality the opposite, right? We don't see this in our actual elections. Okay? We don't see the Republican moving to the center toward the median voter. We don't see the Democrat doing that. In modern politics, we actually see the opposite, where the candidates are moving more toward the extremes. And so I guess the point here in terms of illustrating the median voter theorem is that the idea of issue voting doesn't really work when we take it to its logical extreme. When we extrapolate out to this level where we're identifying, okay, here is where the central tendency of the electorate is. This is how all the candidates should behave based on that. We don't see that degree of correspondence to what theoretically we would expect. Okay? And so it's not as though issue voting happens in this form for everyone, in that that issues are just what dominate elections as term. Okay? There's not that strong of evidence that issues matter to that degree. What we do see, though, is, and this is a point at which I'll bring up the book in a second, a couple of figures and tables that I've brought from the book to illustrate something. So we start investigating these various different, these 3 different conditions for issue voting that I identified. So first of all, do people know where they stand on issues, and do they know where the candidates stand? If we start looking for evidence of this, so here's the first table that I'm going to bring up. So here, this is ANES data, 2016, I think is going to be for most of these tables. So in this column, we're looking at the percentage of voters who are able to place their own themselves on the issue scale. And you see, in this case, it's usually upwards of 80%. So it does seem that most people are fulfilling this first criteria, that at least nominally, based on what they say on the survey, they know more or less where they stand on the issues. Okay, for question number 2, do they know where the candidates stand on the issues? This column, I think, is the one that's most relevant. Okay, do they know that Clinton is more liberal than Trump, which I think most would agree that's accurate. Or in general, I think, do they know that the Democratic candidate is more liberal than the Republican candidate would be the general extension of that question. That's in this column. You can see it varies election to election, but in 2016, for example, almost 3/4 of the electorate knew that Trump was more conservative than Hillary Clinton. In 2012, about 60% of the electorate was able to identify that Obama was more liberal than Romney. Okay, and obviously these are subjective questions to some degree, but the point here just being that, at least in recent elections, this seems to be the case. Okay, that people are able to have a good idea of where the candidates stand on issues. So there's some evidence, even so it doesn't always hold. There's some elections where the rates aren't that high, but there at least is some evidence that people are able to accurately place the candidates on an issue scale. Okay, so that's just illustrating points 1 and 2, that people nominally know where they stand, and oftentimes know where the candidates stand. Question number 3, do people actually use this information to inform their vote? Okay, do they look at where do I stand, where does the candidate stand, and use that to determine which candidate they'll vote for? One other table I'll bring up at the moment to address this. This would be table 6-6 from the book. So this is, in this case, I want to look at, it wasn't entirely clear what was going on in these other columns. So let's just look at the center column. So this is looking at the percentage of voters who voted for the candidate that was closer to them on the issues. Okay. And again, I'll just look at these going back to the various different elections. You see, usually this is near 3/4 of the population of the electorate, I should say. In 2016, upwards of 80% of those who identified, here's one candidate that's closer to me than the other, 81% of the voters in that condition, they voted for the candidate that was closer to them on the issues. And these numbers remain quite high regardless of which election you're talking about. If you're a voter and you recognize that one candidate is closer to you on the issues, you tend to vote for that candidate. And so this is, going back to our notes, some evidence that criterion number 3 holds. Okay, so we do have, when we look, the point of this discussion, going back to our data in the book, is just that we can look at these individual criteria for issue voting, and there is evidence we can point to. Okay, so I would say, the issue voting is probably something that does occur to some degree. The overall conclusion, though, that I would leave you with here in terms of issue voting and for retrospective voting, it's going to be fairly similar. There's disagreement among political scientists regarding the exact frequency, regarding how common issue voting is. It happens among some voters, but is it really something that's driving the majority? Or maybe is the correspondence between issues and the vote, is that sometimes maybe just coincidental? Okay, maybe there's something else going on behind the scenes that's actually driving both issue positions and the candidate vote. And so there's some disagreement as far as the overall extent to which issue voting occurs. And that's I guess the thought I would leave you with here in terms of issue voting and just its frequency. One thing, just a few final points, and this is, I won't go to the book again on these, but I'll leave you with some charts if you want to go back and reread them on your own. So domestic issues, just in terms of the overall importance, breaking it down a little bit into separate issue domains, domestic issues tend to be more important to people than foreign policy issues. And there are some periods in time when we can look at certain foreign policy issues that receive heightened importance. If you go back to the Iraq War, and then more generally the post 9/11 environment, national security issues, foreign policy issues tend to be of heightened importance. But generally speaking, domestic issues, particularly the economy, tend to be considered very important to people relative to foreign policy issues. If you wanted to go back and look at this, table 6-3, which would be page 178, shows you these data, just showing you, I think they look at the 2016 and 2012 elections and the various importances ascribed to the economy versus other issues, and the economy does tend to do very well relative to these other issues in terms of the importance people feel about it. And I think that's where I'll leave it as it pertains to issue voting. There's evidence for it, but there's maybe more to discuss here as well in terms of other potential reasons people may be casting their vote for one candidate versus the other. Okay, so that was what I wanted to cover from chapter 6. Let's move on now to this concept of retrospective voting. Okay, so this is, unless you read ahead, this is not something you have read or will read in this semester since we're in our last week. So I'll just give you a definition here, of retrospective voting and a quick summary of some of the findings with respect to retrospective voting. Okay, so if you're familiar with what the term retrospective means, which hopefully you guys are, retrospective just means looking to the past. Okay, if you're deciding based on retrospective criteria, you're looking at something that has or hasn't occurred in the past and judging your decision based on that retrospective. Particularly what we mean here in the book, if you go into this chapter, you'll get the sense that there are different definitions of what political scientists have defined as retrospective voting. So I'm just giving you, again, sort of a simplified synthesis of all these different definitions we might think about. Uh, Overall, we're talking about voting based on whether or not you judge the incumbent party candidate, I should say, just to be more precise, as being successful here. So vote for the incumbent party's candidate. If you think that the incumbent was successful. So again, I don't know that this is an idea that's groundbreaking or shocking to anyone, but just to illustrate, if you're somebody who's engaging in retrospective voting in the 2020 presidential election, okay, we actually have an incumbent, so it's pretty easy at this point in time. You're going to look at the last 4 years, or actually 3+ at that point in time, of Donald Trump's presidential administration. If you view him as a successful president, you would vote for him for his reelection. If you view him as unsuccessful, we'll put, I guess, successful in quotation because that's a subjective judgment in and of itself. If you view him as unsuccessful, then you're not going to vote for him. It's maybe a little bit more dicey when we get into a situation like we had in 2016, to where we did not have an incumbent running, but perhaps many people were linking the Democratic Party or the Obama administration to Hillary Clinton being a former member at that point in time of the Obama administration, and perhaps linking their judgments of success of the Obama administration to Hillary Clinton. So that would be the application there in a situation in which the incumbent was not running. Perhaps people link the incumbent party to whoever the nominee is in the current election. Okay, so it's a fairly simple idea. So maybe I'll go back to some charts I have from the book for a second, just to illustrate if it's not entirely clear. So here, this would be table 7-1. And, again, some of this is what you would expect. Okay, so here, I might try to zoom in here for a second, just to make sure everyone can see. So here, this is just showing you, first of all, the top part isn't really that important, but it's showing you those who voted for the incumbent party's nominee based on whether or not you're a person who thinks the country is on the right track, or somebody who thinks the country is on the wrong track. Okay, so if you're somebody, just to clarify, if it's not clear at the moment, if you think the country is on the right track, that's a positive retrospective judgment of the incumbent party's president. Okay. If you're on the wrong, if you think the country is on the wrong track, you're giving a negative retrospective evaluation of the incumbent party's president. Okay, so this is sometimes how you'll have you'll see in surveys here at the ANES again, a fairly simple way of measuring one's retrospective on the incumbent party, and things shape out the way you would probably expect, right? If you're somebody who thinks the country is on the right track, you're looking back and you think, okay, things are going well. The incumbent party seems to be doing well. You're voting to reelect at a very strong rate. Okay? So if you thought the country was on the right track, you're voting to put, in this case, it would have been the Democratic Party in 2012 and 2016, back in office at over a 90% rate. Okay? If you're somebody who thinks the country is on the wrong track, you're somebody who is, in this case, looking at the performance of the Obama administration and saying, it doesn't seem like they are really doing the right thing. Maybe we should be going in a different direction than what this administration has been doing. You're voting at only a 30 to mid-30s rate in terms of reelecting the incumbent party to another term in president. Okay, so again, nothing too surprising, but this is something that political scientists would point to and say, retrospective voting may be more important than issue voting. It would be a debate that we're not going to fully have here. The relative importance that different political scientists have discussed amongst themselves for many decades. One other point in terms of retrospective voting, here we're just looking at the simple, you ask the person on the survey, do you think the country's on the right track or the wrong track? Another way that political scientists have gotten at retrospective evaluations is looking at judgments on the performance of the economy. Okay? So here, this is what this chart is showing you. So here, in this column, we're showing you different election years, and this is asking you, or this chart, I should say, is based on a question asking respondents to rate economic performance. Okay, do you think the incumbent has done a good job on the economy or a poor job on the economy? Where again, I mentioned that this is one, in terms of issues, one of the most important issues that people hold. And so, you're looking back and you're trying to decide, okay, in 2000, you're saying, has Bill Clinton done a good job on the economy or not a good job on the economy? Bush, Obama. Obama. Okay, you're looking back and evaluating the incumbent party's president on the economy. If you think that the incumbent party's president is doing a good job, okay, you think, in other words, you have a positive view on the president's economic performance, you're voting at a pretty high rate in each of these cells to re-elect the incumbent party's nominee. Okay, usually around 90%, at least if you look at these 4 years. If you're somebody who thinks that the incumbent president has done a poor job on the economy, you're really very rarely going to want to re-elect the incumbent party's nominee to another term, or maybe re-elect isn't the word, but just whether it be an incumbent running or somebody from the incumbent party, you're not going to want to elect that party back to the presidency. Okay. So that's retrospective voting. This would be political scientists today. It's not necessarily about issues. It's about people looking back to the last 4 years and evaluating whether they think the incumbent party's president has done a good job in voting based on that. And there's a lot more, if you're interested in this topic more than what I'm letting on, there's a lot more in chapter 7 for you. For the sake of continuing the video though, so retrospective voting, issue voting, these are 2 decision criteria in terms of the choice to vote for the Republican or the Democrat that I would characterize have some, again, they have some basis in data, but there would be debate as far as their prevalence. Okay, one factor in the vote that I think there's very little debate, at least in terms of it being a major factor in determining people's vote, would be party identification. Okay, so at the beginning of the video, I previewed and said that I would give you one of these 3 factors as being strongest pretty clearly out of the 3, and it would be this, party identification. Just in terms of a definition here, most of you probably know what this is from other classes, or we maybe have discussed it at some point in time in our semester. In terms of party identification, we're not talking about registration per se. So in some states, when you go and register to vote, you can say, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm some other party, or I have no party affiliation. We're not talking about that legal classification. Okay, we're talking about instead a psychological attachment to a party, right? And these 2 things maybe will coincide with one another pretty often. If you're somebody who is registered with the party, you're probably more often than not going to be identifying with that party. But in terms of identification, specifically, we're talking about a psychological attachment to one party or another. Okay, personal identification that you hold as a psychological construct attaching you to one of the parties. And in this case, we're talking about Republican or Democrat, the 2 major parties. And again, I'd say there is some discussion among political scientists of the best way to define party identification. Here I'm giving you what I would say is the mainstream view, the most commonly held view, that party identification in general is a psychological attachment to the Republican or Democratic Party. And if it's not obvious, or if it's not something you already know, this is by far the strongest predictor of one's vote. Okay, if I were to give you the task of predicting every person in the electorate's vote if I were to give you only one factor that you had access to, the most predictive factor that you could have is party identification. Okay, so this is by far the strongest variable in predicting votes. Okay. That being said, just in case there's a uncertainty as far as the exact magnitude, again, here we're into a situation where this is not groundbreaking information, but here's a chart from the book, chapter 8 in this case. Yeah, this is asking for the percentage, or it's charting, I should say, the percentage of the voters in each cell that voted for the Democratic Party candidate for president, where higher numbers mean greater proportions of these people voted Democratic. Okay. Probably not super surprising, but if you look at very strong Democrats, most of them, the vast majority, are voting Democratic. If you look at strong Republicans, the vast majority of them are not voting Democratic, i.e. they're voting Republican. Okay, so the overall point here is just illustrating the degree of correspondence from partisanship, one's party identification, to the vote choice. It's an extremely strong correspondence. So even if you look at, maybe not strong Democrats, we just look at what we consider less strong Democrats, weaker Democrats, or those who say they're independent but lean toward the Democratic Party, you still have these really huge numbers. Okay? More than 3/4 of people that are describing themselves as such in the Republican Party. Again, here in this case, still, even if you're just leaning at the Republican Party or you're identifying as a weaker Republican, it's still overwhelmingly predicting that you will vote for the Republican candidate. Because this is a very strong measure of partisanship, party identification. What I would say here is this. When we discuss party identification, we're not going to get fully into tracing the implications of this variable, but it's something that doesn't just, I'm discussing here the correspondence between party identification and the vote choice. It's really something that fundamentally affects most elements of political thought, though, even ones we're not talking about, right? So when we're talking about these other concepts in the class, like issue positions, issue perceptions, retrospective evaluations, those are all probably things that in and of themselves are being influenced by one's party identification. Okay, so you're based on the party that you are identified with, you're subject to an entire host of political biases that are making you think about the political world in a way that's much different than somebody who is identifying with the other party. Okay, so it's not only a very predictive variable in terms of the vote choice, it's very influential in a number of different domains affecting political thought. So here, I guess I'll just for the sake of our notes, strongest predictor of the vote. In more toward that last point I made about the other influences of party identification, it's also something that we can point to patterns in the data to illustrate that it is influencing our issue positions. So we talked about issue voting, so party identification is influencing potentially issue voting. As well as our retrospective evaluations. And here, just to show you a few other charts in the book to show you, to illustrate this, we talked about issue voting, we talked about retrospective voting. These are both different means of voting that seem to be pretty closely tied to one's partisanship. And this is table 8-7 in the book, if anyone wants to look at it on their own. There's a lot going on in this chart. What I wanted to just summarize is that your party identification corresponds pretty closely to your issue positions. So here, for instance, just to summarize in a simple form, if you're a strong Democrat, your issue positions are corresponding to the Democratic candidate, but they're closer to the Democratic candidate 64% of the time. If you are, to look at it from the opposite direction, a strong Republican, your views, your issue positions are corresponding to those of the Republican candidate more so than the Democratic candidate 87% of the time. Okay, so just the connection here is going back to our discussion of issue voting. Issue voting is saying that you are voting for the candidate that's most closely aligning to your own issues. If you're identifying as a Democrat, that's very often, most of the time, going to be the Democratic candidate. If you are a Republican, more often than not, that's going to be with the Republican candidate. And so again, partisanship is perhaps influencing issue positions. In terms of retrospective voting, okay, again, we discussed this as being the idea that you are going to evaluate the performance of the incumbent president, and if the incumbent president is doing well in your view, you're going to you're going to vote for the incumbent president's party in the next election. And so here, this chart is showing you on the x-axis different grades of party identification, and then finally on the y-axis, it's showing you the percentage here of those who are approving of the Democratic incumbent. In this case, there will be another figure, which I'll show you here in a second, for Republican incumbents. For Democrats, though, you see, again, probably what you would expect. If you are a Democrat, so here in one of these three columns, you are, generally speaking, evaluating a Democratic incumbent retrospectively, again, fairly well. If you're a Republican, you're much lower on the graph here. You tend to evaluate a Democratic incumbent very low. Okay, so again, retrospective evaluations of the incumbent president seemingly influenced by one's party identification. And then this next graph, figure 8.1-B, is showing you what the prior graph is showing you, just for Republicans rather than Democrats. And my computer's having issues. So yeah, here you're seeing just the opposite trend. When you look at Democrats in this case, their retrospective evaluations of the president tend to be in this range. Republican president in this case. If you're a Republican, your retrospective evaluations of the Republican president tends to be higher up on the graph. And there's a lot more discussion here to be had as far as the influence of partisanship on things like retrospective evaluations and things like issue positions. The overall point would be this, to wrap up the discussion and link some of these concepts. So again, we started out asking the question, what's causing somebody to decide to vote for the Republican or the Democratic candidate? Vote choice, Republican or Democrat. And we have things like issue voting we talked about, potentially playing a role. And perhaps having something to do with this, retrospective evaluations. Again, perhaps having some role. What I'm saying here as it pertains to party ID is this. I'm saying that the identification as a Democrat or Republican, it's going to have a pretty major direct effect on the vote choice, but it also perhaps is influencing the way issue voting works, the way retrospective voting works. And so in this sense, it's both the strongest predictor of the vote choice R or D. It's also, in some sense, the most fundamental factor influencing a whole host of these different evaluation criteria. It's affecting how you perceive your issue views and the different candidates' issue positions. It's affecting how you're retrospectively evaluating a presidential performance, depending on whether or not it's a president who's a Republican or a Democrat. And so party ID, it's really operating pretty much in any of these different means of voting that we're discussing. And so it's a very influential factor. I'm going to leave it there. This video is starting to get long, and I don't want it to go too long. This is just, again, my summary here. First of all, chapter 6 that you read, and then these other chapters that you will not have read, but I wanted to give you some flavor for. This is the last week of the semester, so this is the last of these lecture videos I'm going to post on these chapters. I would just say in way of reminders, you have the paper due this week, which hopefully you guys, if you're listening to this on or before Friday, it's due Friday before midnight. You have the final exam for this class on May the 4th. which is a little bit down the road. You can anticipate having a review sheet for the final in the next several days. The final will be online, of course, and I'll give you more details on the review sheet as we go along. You can expect it to be semi-cumulative, to where it'll involve, it'll probably place more of an emphasis on things we've discussed in the class, uh, since our first test, but it will also have a cumulative component where you would want to revisit some of the concepts that we discussed earlier in the semester as well. And then finally, I'm going to be available for my virtual office hours each Wednesday from here to the next few weeks when we enter finals week, excuse me. I'll be available at the normal time, which would be Wednesdays, 11:45 to 1 p.m. for this class. Really, at any time that you would want to meet with me, I can probably make it work. Just let me know. I'm also available for appointments. So anything that you want to talk about or concerns that you have or questions that you have going forward into our final, go ahead and let me know, and I'd be happy to talk about them with you. That being said, I hope everyone's doing well. As always, I'll be back in touch. Again, like I said, in a few days with the review sheet. So good luck with your, not only this class. I know you guys have this paper. You probably have other papers. You have other finals going on as well, coming up in a few weeks. I hope everyone's managing to cope with the interruption and the changes to everyone's classes. I hope everyone's remaining healthy. So until I talk to you guys again, goodbye for now.